The United States Supreme Court made a major ruling where it's shadow docket behavior, which Harry Littman, you and I don't like. It strikes again, and in there allowing the Trump regime to engage in third country deportations. The six right-wing justices don't provide any justification. There's no legal analysis at all. They just say, we are going to stay or pause a district court ruling which blocked Trump's unlawful behavior. The district court's the trial level court. They get all of the evidence, and we've been seeing this across the country and how the Supreme Court's exercised its shadow docket to use this kind of procedural excuse, but to kind of really get out the merits that's causing irreparable harm to the true victims here that the district court's trying to protect. So this case involved a migrant who was like sex trafficked from Guatemala and then sent to Mexico, where he was raped in Mexico and then fled to the United States. And there was a finding, you can't send this guy back to Guatemala. They didn't reach the issue of Mexico yet, just because no one envisioned that someone would send this guy back to Mexico after all he had been with. But there's him, and there's a number of other people who got consolidated, into this case. And the Trump regime just like, yeah, we'll send this guy back to Mexico, or we'll send some of these other people to Sudan, sending other people to Sudan. And the district court's like, no, you can't do that, because the district court analyzed when third country deportations are allowed. And they said they are allowed, but third-party deportations, because of international treaties the United States is in, like an international treaty against human torture, and our own laws here in the United States, third-party deportations, because you're taking a human being and sending them to countries where they're not from, that really has to be handled with the utmost care. So that's like the last thing you could possibly do if there's no other justification to do it, and you have to make very specific findings, and it requires a lot of kind of heightened scrutiny. The Trump regime's like, screw it, we're just sending people, we don't care. Send them to Sudan, to El Salvador, we don't care. And the district court says, let's be clear, you do actually have the ability to do these things, but not just the way you did it. Follow the law, go through the steps, and I'm going to issue an injunction that just says you need to follow the law. The status quo is Congress passed laws. We entered into international treaties, which were affirmed by Congress as well. Those are the laws. Follow them. And so the Trump regime seeks an emergency application. They go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they say, we, the Trump regime, we are going to face irreparable injury and harm if you infringe on our executive branch authorities. This is national security. This is invasion. This is all of these things. We suffer. Donald Trump, victim. I'm going to suffer if I can't send people to Djibouti and Sudan. That's basically what their argument is. And we've seen this argument before. We've seen the tension between the six right-wing justices who basically automatically give Donald Trump these stays and pause the district court. And they do it under the guise of, oh, we're not saying that we're being cruel. We're just preserving the status quo. And the status quo was the Trump regime entered into this executive order. And that's the status quo. We got to follow what they're doing. Go and litigate the case. Bring the case back up to us when it's right for our review. But let's preserve the status quo as it existed when there was a Trump regime executive order. The issue, of course, from the three Democratic appointed judges is they're saying, nah, the status quo, you idiots. They didn't say idiots, but I'm going to say it. The status quo was the law. Was you follow the steps and the procedures. Trump broke the status quo and said he's going to violate the law. So why are you embracing his status quo versus what the law was and what the district court built in a very detailed record to protect what the real status quo was pre-Trump regime screwing with the law? So that's what we see in a very detailed dissent, in a shadow docket ruling where the majority, the six right-wing justices, say nothing, but then the three Democratic appointed justices, they lay out the law and they say, at this point, you basically just killed these people. You sent them to Sudan. They're never going to get a trial. This is how you've killed them, but try to, I guess, make yourself feel morally okay about it. So, Harry, break it down.
Gladly, although it's as you say. Let me just say, as a shadow docket matter, there are different ways to think about it. This is as bad as it gets. On the one hand, you have really very bad, as you said, and as Sotomayor details, results in human terms. It's really likely the case that many people will die. On the other hand, you have the perfect absence of any explanation by the court. This is now a big case. It's become a public case. Everyone's focused on it, and they could not say less. It's simply, we got this. Justice Jackson referred it to us. We're entering the stay. And they say the stay is entered, and therefore this harm that we were just talking about will occur until the First Circuit decides the case on the merits, and the Supreme Court either takes the case and decides it on the merits or doesn't accept cert. So we're talking about months to maybe a year or more, during which people can just be shipped off, as you say, according to the executive order. To stitch one little detail up, this started with the guy who came up from Guatemala, then through Mexico, where he was also tortured. And the judge at the time was pretty measured with the United States, said, well, has anyone asked him, is he afraid to go to Mexico? Oh, we did, Your Honor. And he says it's fine. That turned out to be complete confabulation. And when it came time to actually show that, they had nothing. They had this humiliating declaration saying, uh-oh, our bad, nobody ever said it. At that point is when the judge got pretty serious, and he has got a class that is anyone who could go to a third party nation. So this guy who was returned on his order, Mexico, that's not where he's from. And then all these people, as you say, in South Sudan, this was the place where Murphy, the judge, in the nick of time said, learning from the example of Boasberg when they sent things off to El Salvador, stop the damn plane and give them the due process that they had given them, just a piece of paper in English saying you're subject to being deported. Here you go. And he said, no, you have to give them certain notice, and you have to give them certain rights. And we've had this weird spectacle, because he's let the U.S. do it, of a plane supposedly on the tarmac in East Africa, where they're going through all this stuff, which is by way of saying this judge was really jerked around by the U.S. and nevertheless he issued a pretty modest order. Just as you say, Ben, do what the law requires, and you can do it as you like. I'll give you some room in the joints. So now the Supreme Court comes in. Zero work. So first, all the flaws of any shadow docket. No briefing, no argument, whatever. And then an absolutely taciturn, completely opaque reason for the ruling. And, you got to think the court in this situation really should have the back of a federal judge who was totally jerked around by the U.S., and they don't. So Sotomayor, we're in June, and just like last week, she did the same thing. She read from the bench in that Tennessee transgender case, and very pointedly, didn't say respectfully, said sadly or something. She does the same thing here. She says respectfully, but also says sadly. And she makes 2 points: everything you say about the law, but also people are going to die. And legally, Ben, here's the big sort of point. When you do this kind of changing of the status quo, and the status quo is what the district court had done, you got to show 4 things in favor of the United States. And we have no idea why, but let's say they conclude, there's a lot of arguments about, is there jurisdiction? And let's say they concluded, did the 6, that the U.S., one of those was accurate, so it was likely to succeed on the merits. Maybe, we don't know. It's perfectly opaque, as I say. But the point that seems to have happened, and what Sotomayor is saying, is that's just one of 4. It's the most important, but irreparable injury, balance of equities and public interest. And as you say, irreparable injury, give me a friggin' break. For the administration, it's keeping them detained and just going through the process that is due under the Constitution. That's their injury. For the people now, if it goes the other way, as you say, they may be going to South Sudan, and we're talking some serious irreparable injury, and the court doesn't even seem to have looked at it. And if they did, they won't as much as tell these litigants and the American people who are following this now why they did it. So as an example of as bad as the shadow docket can get on the merits and the failure to go through and just the complete opacity, what the heck are you doing there? Oh, we're not telling you. This is you can't get worse than this, because they literally at every turn, they hurt the people, and they give zero guidance. This is the example of the problems with the shadow docket par excellence.
Yeah, it's like, just tell us to give guidance. That's what you do as a Supreme Court. Why are you? What factors are you balancing? How are you weighing irreparable harm? Are you considering a probability of success on the merits? How could you possibly consider a probability of success on the merits when all of the merits seem to go against that proposition? And the way I described it is, I don't think it's a radical position that before you send somebody to Sudan or you send somebody to El Salvador, you've got to make sure that that's one, that there's due process and some semblance of it, and two, that when you then make the decision to send not to their country of origin, that there's a real reason for it. I mean, how do you send a Mexican to Sudan? I mean, how do you send a Venezuelan to the Congo? How do you send somebody from the Congo to El Salvador? Why? What's your basis for it? Even if they're ultimately ruled that they should be deported, come on, give us some facts, give us some info. So, Harry, that's where I side on these issues. Is just I want to make sure we let people know why the Supreme Court is so wrong, but it's just a very nefarious thing. I don't think it's, again, radical positions you and I take. Just give us,
or show us why they're right, but state the arguments. Maybe they have some notion of there was no jurisdiction, or maybe they don't like Sotomayor says maybe he abuses discretion in how much time he gives, 21 days. But come on, the stakes are high. You are the Supreme Court of the United States. This is front and center, part of a national debate on executive power and due process. Give us some guidance and argument, for God's sake. If it's right, show us why you are, as you say, Ben,
I'll give you
Court of the United States.
I think I'll tie it together with. I was just thinking about this as you were saying this. The one common thread that I think Roberts is trying to do, how there's the expression constitutional avoidance. If you can avoid ruling on the Constitution, try to find some other way to avoid it. Right. I think that they're trying desperately over the next 4 years to avoid that inevitable showdown with Trump. And I just think in their own mind, they give him these things, as bad as they are. And ultimately, when they have, like with the Abrego Garcia, the facilitate the return type of ruling, that's like, it's those rulings that they're trying desperately to avoid, unless it has to go there. Because what Roberts is worried about is, remember, he and the right-wing justices gave this maniac absolute immunity. So when Trump uses absolute immunity to finally say, I'm not following your order, then the Supreme Court looks totally feckless and they don't exist. And then it not only exposes the whole institution as being weak and irrelevant, it further shows how wrong they were to give this guy absolute immunity. So I think the six are like, and it's horrible to say, these immigrants, we don't care. Like, they're in our bigger Game of Thrones, we'll kill them. and we don't give a crap, and we'll come up with a procedural way. But what we're trying to guard is kind of to cover up for their own foil in destroying the court. But that's my read. Everybody subscribe to the Talking Feds YouTube channel, the Talking Feds podcast, and the Talking Feds Substack. Subscribe to all three. Harry Litman, always a pleasure.
Likewise, Ben. Talk to you soon. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.